Hello, welcome to INN's Headlines and Beyond. Uh, on this edition, we'll be looking at the usual suspects the way we did last night, including a look back at the Cold War since we have been talking about a look forward or looking forward to the Third World War. There's been an enormous amount of chatter in the blogosphere and beyond about what's going on in the Middle East, particularly surrounding Iran and the Third World War. There's been a lot of sort of predictions and, how should we say, concerns. So let's take a look at what's happening in Libya, considering that we're now considering the same thing in Syria, doing the same thing in Syria that we did in Libya. And what's going on now, if anyone's been following this, is that Libya is now starting to fracture into two different spheres, and it looks like that Libya itself, because it has not been able to get the weapons that were given to the various different rebel groups as they were armed and trained by the West. They're not able to get the weapons back. They can't demilitarize the things that they have set up and militarized. In Egypt, the whole plan of this Arab Spring thing has gone south, where we were having the Islamists and the Islamic parties being elected in overwhelming majorities, so that you're having countries that were once, well, they weren't perfect or what the West would like to see, now leaching forward even further beyond what they want to see into more Islamic-oriented governments, and of course Sharia law following in its place, or in its wake. So when you go back and look at Libya, at Syria, to see what's going on in Syria, and the news has now started confirming that the Iranian commandos are in supporting Syria, which is no surprise since we already know that the Mossad and the CIA are involved. And when you hear that there were French mercenaries in there as well, you can well imagine almost every intelligence agency and group with a vested interest in the Middle East is in there. So, not surprisingly, even former Israeli government ministers admitted that Al Qaeda is in there, and they suspect that the large chunk of the rebels themselves are actually Al Qaeda in Syria. And so this was sort of the conflict going on, as whether or not it was a prudent move to supply arms and weapons to known members of Al Qaeda. And here's the problem that the West and the Western media have. And it goes back to one that I had talked about in last night's edition. And this is the one of presenting evidence that's beyond reproach, or the way you would present evidence and look at what you have in terms of observations is, can you pinpoint a particular video or a photograph from multiple sources? Now, I have video of the jihadists, and I'll call them jihadists, that's what they are, attacking Syrian army convoys, attacking from buildings, and they have this on their jihadist website, and every time they have, as they're bombing and shooting at these targets, you hear Allah Akbar, their standard refrain. They have pictures of what they call Assad's security forces, even though they're in plain clothes, assassinated and murdered, and you see the blood, you see the flaming cars, and you hear on the video Allah Akbar, and with pointing to the fact that they had killed this Bashir, this Bashir security guard, the Syrian security guard. Then when you hear from Israeli ministers saying that that they too know that Al Qaeda is in there after you've been watching all these videos produced by Al Qaeda on jihadist websites. You can find them easily on their websites, bragging about their ambushes, bragging about their attacks, and then you go to try to look and see what you can find in terms of evidence of brutality by Bashir against these people, against the innocent civilians of Syria, and you can't find any. And all the pictures that I've seen on CNN and BBC, the ones that when they show video footage, these what they call as footage is not footage. Is a picture of maybe a shelled out building. Someone took a photograph of a puddle or a river running in a gully that looked like it had blood in it. But this isn't evidence that you're having massacres there. This is not that evidence there. Human Rights Watch put out a military satellite photograph, and they've docked all the marks where they say that there are crater marks. But the thing is, you can't see that the crater marks are there. All you see are the yellow dots that they put and say, "Hey, there are crater marks here." These pictures, these satellite pictures put up by Human Rights Watch, look remarkably, and this was on CNN, this was on BBC, look remarkably like the photographs that were used prior to the invasion of Iraq, pointing out where the weapons of mass destruction were. So a lot of the evidence against the Bashar regime, and let's give because no regime is perfect. All regimes, including Obama, has blood on its hand. No one is clean in geopolitics. This is the problem here. You can't simply say one person is different than the other until you actually have evidence of this. And so far, the evidence against Bashir is simply the West and the UN saying that there is evidence against Bashir without actually showing anything. And the problem is that there isn't, with the West and with Iraq, in a very recent rearview mirror, there is a huge credibility gap. You can't trust the UN. You can't trust the International Atomic Agency. You can't trust any of these organizations because a lot of what they had been saying in Iraq before all the stuff that's going on in Syria, what turned out to be false. So the question is now is that I'm not going to give up looking for this evidence. I have now several options in front of me that I have to work on this week in terms of might be able to get some sources within Syria to see what's actually going on in there. Even though the photojournalists and the ones who were evacuated from Syria during the shelling of homes came out with no photographic evidence whatsoever. There's been nothing published. I mean, if they're actually journalists and they're not actually intelligence agencies, because don't forget, part of this whole new intelligence thing now is that you can have, they're not going to come and tell you, oh yes, we're intelligence agents. They're going to have covers. They're going to be reporters. They're going to be medical personnel. They're going to be looking like that they belong in that environment. They're not, and even after they've been pulled out like this, they're not going to say we were and are military intelligence or intelligence agents. So the question is that if these journalists were indeed journalists, where is their photographic evidence? I mean, it's so easy to carry a phone camera. The evidence that you could have gotten with these professional journalists could have been so hard against the Bashir that there would be no doubt that Bashir is slaughtering his people. But that hasn't surfaced. All that surfaced and that we've seen on TV are pictures that could, and video that could easily be doctored. I mean, if you're on YouTube and you watch some of these videos being put together by some of these kids with Final Cut 10 Pro or any of these things, you know the special effects that can be put into them. And a lot of these pictures of smoke rising from a city or behind the city on the horizon, or something that looks like fire on a distant rooftop, that can be added in as effect so easily. It can be so easily a doctored photograph, and you wouldn't know it. In other words, you can't state that with any degree of certainty what's being put out on BBC, on CNN, or any of these channels has any degree of credibility. You can't go and say, well, yeah, there must be something seriously going on in Homs, that Bashir must be slaughtering his people. But you can't say that, because the evidence doesn't exist there. You can go and say, if these news media outlets had gone and done their research that they were supposed to, that Al-Qaeda's in there, because Al-Qaeda has video footage of it. They're on their jihadist websites with their chants and their singing. They've got the footage of their attacks on the Bashiri army. They got attacks on the oil refineries. They've got attacks on the security guards. They've shown assassinations. And because we see this on the jihadist websites, and we know that the jihadists have dressed up as and infiltrated security compounds as police in Afghanistan, Iraq, right? They've infiltrated the army in Afghanistan, in Iraq. We've seen this tactic. We know this tactic, that they dress up and act as official members in order to get in places to commit or to blow places up. And then the jihadists have no problems shooting and killing their own Muslim people. We've seen this time and time again. So the question is, what's happening in Homs? When you see a lot of the stuff on the jihadist stuff popping up, but you don't see anything on Bashir's side popping up, and there could be. I don't believe this guy is so savvy that he's blocking every attempt, even though these reporters have escaped and a number of people have escaped, that you couldn't get better evidence. But right now, we're not seeing it. So my call on Syria right now is to sort of compare it to Syria, compare the actions of the Syrian government to the actions of the Israeli government, to the people they call terrorists. Take Israel's actions in Gaza. Take Israel's actions with the West Bank. Take Israel's action in Lebanon, and then compare Syria's regime to that. If they're exceeding what Israel had done, then yes, there's a massacre going on. If they're not, and we call Israel as we'll call a defense response and the right that they have, and Obama has said this many times, that Israel has a right to defend itself. And we've heard this time and time again from members of AIPAC. We've heard this on the press. We've heard it from almost every single American representative who've gone up who were in front of the camera. Any member of the American government has said this. So if the response of Israel in Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon was its right, and what we had is collateral damage, you cannot hold the Syrian government to any standard beyond. You can't hold that. That has to be the standard. You can't say, oh, well, that's a different situation, and these people aren't terrorists. Well, the thing is, there are terrorists, and we know Al Qaeda. Israel's some of their former minister have said that Al Qaeda is in this. This is information that's coming out of Israel. It's not coming out of the American media that is more or less controlled by AIPAC. Well, I mean controlled, but I say heavily influenced by AIPAC, because no one has any absolute. There is no absolute control over anything. Information that you want to find out there is out there. You can, if you dig and you do your proper job as a researcher, you can find the evidence. And this is the problem that I'm having. I can't find the proper evidence to back up the claims that are coming out of the BBC, the CNN, the UN, the United States, that there is a massacre going on in Syria, that there's a massacre going on in Homs against their own people. What I see in comparison to the Israeli strikes is exactly the same thing. And if you're not going to hold Israel to a particular standard, you cannot hold Syria to that standard. This is not to say that the people don't deserve humanitarian aid. This has nothing to do with it. This has to do with how do you resolve international geopolitical issues in an effective manner. And the thing is, this leads us to this whole wider area in the Middle East, and particularly with Iran and the call on the oil prices there, is that we've seen this brinksmanship that we're seeing, and it is not new. All you have to do is go back to the Cold War to see this. This is a lot of stuff that you see in the Cold War, when you had Russia against the United States. The talks that eventually led to treaties began with Richard Nixon and took years to accomplish. And they were finally accomplished in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, but they really weren't accomplished in the manner that we think they were accomplished. They were accomplished. If you go back to watch some of the sitcoms from the 1980s, you'll see this. The accomplishments came in the 1990s after the Soviet Union had collapsed and now became Russian. You had that revolution that first swept in Gorbachev, and then from Gorbachev you had Boris Yeltsin, and from Boris Yeltsin you now have Putin. So this we can trace back to there, and we can sort of see what goes on. And one of the interesting aspects that came out of the Cold War was during the Clinton administration, you had a TV show out there called Murphy Brown. And this was a sort of behind-the-scenes sitcom of a popular, we call her Barbara Walters type of anchor. She was a mix between Barbara Walters and Peter Jennings and all the hard-hitting news people who went in and really dug for the truth and were really gung-ho on putting the news out unfettered, uncensored, unadjusted, just the raw facts, unlike the infotainment that we have today. And the irony was that most of this show occurred under the first George Bush as president, with Vice President Dan Quayle. And a lot of their hemming and hawing was at how draconian and Orwellian that the White House was under the Republicans. And here's where the irony comes in. They celebrate the election of President Clinton, but at the same time, the show ends on a very sour note. It ends with the TV news station being taken over by a corporate media environment, and then slowly censoring out all the top news for more entertaining news, what we call infotainment. And this is where we sit today. Today, most of what you see on CNN, even on the BBC, and I'm going to say even in Al Jazeera now, Al Jazeera has really demonstrated a bias now, where they show that on many news broadcasts, it's about making the broadcast as sensational as possible. It's about blood, it's about guts, it's about gore, and in many cases, it's about promoting a particular political platform. It is not about really digging in and showing both sides of the situation, really showing what the situation is about. This is what you no longer see in mainstream media. That's gone. Anderson Cooper's guilty of it. Wolf Blitzer's guilty of it. Almost every show that you see, whether it's Barbara Walters, ABC, doesn't matter what the channel is, if it's a corporate environment or a government-sponsored environment, like BBC and Al Jazeera is, then you're dealing with something that is heavily tuned, heavily adjusted for a political position or financial purposes. And this was highlighted, and you said you have to go back and watch Murphy Brown. Go watch. No, I'm not going to watch for the specific episode. My recommendation is now go find the sitcom Murphy Brown. Try YouTube if you can. You should be able to find it on YouTube. Watch it. Watch the entire series, and then compare it to what's going on today in the media. And I think you'll see something really, really important in there. And it really kind of predicts what's been going on. So where does this leave us now? Well, this brings us back to one of the old Cold War standards in terminology known as brinksmanship. How close can you get to creating a war without actually having the war spill over and become World War III? This is what's occurring now in the Middle East. Right now, there are a number of groups out there, and this is not any one specific group. Well, any one specific group. There's a whole number of them from the Islamics, from the Christians, from the Israelis, groups who believe that the end of the world is coming, that we are in the last days. And their particular view is if they help this so-called war, the last war, to occur, that they will be given the favor of God and the best positions as His ministers. This isn't a fight to be a child of God. This is a fight for servile positions. They're not looking at being children of God. They're looking at being servants of God. And who's going to be the first? I mean, the term prime minister. All the prime minister really is, if you look at the title, is he's the head butler. That's all he is. The prime minister is the head butler. And you have all these people who are fighting and trying to create a third world war, this final war, so that they can become the head butler to this God king who's going to supposedly come. And so, but these people have enough money and enough influence that it is influencing a lot of this brinksmanship that we're seeing today and over these last few weeks, in particular with the situation in Iran and Israel. And this whole talk of World War III is not necessarily a good thing because we don't know what's going to happen after World War III. The prophecies of the end of the world were also said in the Gospel. You can read that it's not hard and fast that these things are going to happen. And that we shouldn't be concerned with the end of the world. We should be concerned with the end of our time, personally, and where we stand with God. So this whole argument that, we have to create this war X, Y, and Z in order to incur the favor of God is insanity, essentially. But the thing is, this insanity is not exclusive to the religious right. And there are a number of people out there who are now talking, and this is primarily when I see it on YouTube, the people who are arguing and saying about, oh, how they can't wait for the day when a religious society no longer exists. And the problem is these people haven't read history. They're ignoring history. Because what do they think the Soviet Union was? To understand and see what would happen to society if we entered into a fully and truly atheist communist society, all you have to do is look at the Soviet Union. Look at the Bolshevik Revolution. To understand that these people believed, in order for true communism to occur, that you needed a social and global bloodletting. You needed this massive uprising and revolution of the masses in order for this global socialist utopia to emerge. And in this global socialist utopia, they have conditionings. They have re-education camps. And this is all, why I say, read George Orwell, because a lot of this is described in George Orwell. And a lot of the mechanism that we see today is in Machiavelli's The Prince. And we can see that we look back at the gulags of the Soviet Union. We look back at the re-education camps of the Soviet Union. We see that people were put into mental institutions, and all these chemicals that we're now using on the kids, our kids today, in terms of these antidepressants and these antipsychotic drugs. A lot of these drugs were used in the Soviet Union before this. And the Soviet Union had no problem executing people who did not view and think the way they did. And as a matter of fact, that was if re-education fails, those who do not have the right think, the proper thing, the politically correct thinking, needed to be eliminated for the benefit of society. This was their view. And this is the view currently that is out there, but is hidden in the background. So a lot of what's happening today can actually be seen in history. And this is why history is so important. And this is why history, what I call modern history, basically from 1900 on, will be presented on this channel as well. Because history is enormously important. This is why I'm going to say, go back and watch MASH. Go back and watch Murphy Brown. Pick up the books, the writings of George Orwell. Pick up the works of Machiavelli, and particularly the Prince. And next week I'll be bringing back more readings and viewings for you to take a look at, so that you can see what has happened before, so you can understand what's happening now. Anyways, I was going to talk more about Joseph Kony, but I'm going to leave that for a documentary. I'm going to do something more specific on that sometime next week. So I said every 2 weeks we're going to do a documentary. So that means next weekend we can look forward to the first documentary to appear on INN. I will leave the documentaries for the weekends rather than doing the headline, because things seem to be really slowing down this weekend. So rather than doing headlines throughout the weekend, I'm going to leave it, and we will see you again Monday evening.